Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to use one of the stamps from the Spellbinders and House Mouse Designs collaboration winter collection. I'm going to use this We Love You stamp and I'm going to create a trifold card. I thought this image was absolutely adorable, but I also thought it would be really cute to cut them into individual panels and create a trifold card with it. So the first thing I'm doing is putting some Hammermill cardstock in my Misti, and I'm masking off the two outer mice. I'm only going to stamp the center one. You could use a post-it note to mask them off, but I find that painter's tape works just as easy and it holds in place really, really well. This way I can ink that stamp in the center or that image in the center and not worry about getting ink on those side ones and having to try to wipe it off and get it nice and clean before stamping it. So I've got my first image stamped here. I'm using a baby wipe to wipe that ink off. I'm going to be coloring this image with Copic markers. So I'm using Memento ink. It's a nice alcohol ink friendly ink for stamping. And I'm cleaning that stamp off and drying it to make sure there's no moisture on it. I don't want any impression from that center image. For the two outer ones, I thought I could get away with not masking them off, but right with that first mouse there, I got a little bit of ink a little bit too far in. So I cleaned that off and then took that same painter's tape I used for the first part, and I am masking that center mouse off just to make sure that that stays nice and clean. And then I don't have to be nearly as careful when I'm inking it. I'm using that same Memento ink and I'm using a different piece of Hammermill cardstock. Not only is the Hammermill good for foiling, but it's great for stamping and coloring with Copics. So once I stamped it the first time, I realized I missed a little area. So I'm trying to get that area stamped better. And I did get that, but then I realized those two were a little bit different hues of black. So I went and added a second layer to the other one. I let those dry for a few minutes to make sure that that ink is nice and dry before I start to color. I'm going to do all of my mice the same color, and I'm going to do all of the letters on the sticks the same color as well. So for the mice, I'm using Copic W3, W5, and W7. And for the little noses, tails, ears, hands, I'm using E00 and E02. When I color with Copics, I always start with the lightest color. Then I go in and do some of the shading with the medium color. And then I go in and deepen that shading lines with the darkest color and go back to the medium color to the light. So I go light, medium, dark, medium, light. I know I've seen some people that have just gone in right with the dark and then go from dark to medium to light. You can do that as well. This is how I was taught many years ago. I want to say 15, 20 years ago. And it's what I'm comfortable with. It's how I like to color. So I just keep doing it. The thing I like about coloring with Copics is the paper doesn't start to pill at all. So you can take your time with coloring. And even if after the color has dried, you want to deepen some shadows or you want to highlight something a little bit more or just add a little bit more blending, you can absolutely do that. And that paper isn't going to start to pill at all. So I'm doing the same coloring method with all three mice. I'm doing the light color, medium, and I've already got the dark color in there. And then I go back in with the medium and I go over the areas where the medium and dark is to blend those two together. Once I have done that, I'm going to go over the entire mouse bodies with the lightest color to get all of those colors blending. And the nice thing about these markers is they continue to blend while they're dry. So even if the color blending isn't absolutely perfect the first time, while they dry, often it blends a little bit more, evens out a little bit more. And like I said, if you don't quite like it after the first time once it's dry, you can go back in and touch it up. I always start out when I'm doing my first light and medium layer with a very, very light touch. I put less ink on because as I'm adding the different layers, each one of those colors is going to get a little bit darker. And that just allows so that color doesn't get too dark. Now, this same method would work for probably any alcohol marker. I only have Copic markers. I have tried a few other ones. This is what I have always had and I love them, so I've never switched to other ones. Who knows, maybe one day. For the mice in the tail, or the tails and the ears and the hands, I'm only doing two colors, so E00 and E02. Because these areas are so tiny, I didn't really feel the need to do any more than two colors for the light and then the shading. You could if you wanted to. And even with the blending of the mice, you could do several colors if you want. Like I'm doing 3, you could do 4 or 5 if you wanted to deepen those colors. My comfort zone typically is 3. Sometimes I'll add a 4th one in there if I need a little bit more depth to it, but I typically will go with 3. One of the things that I'm going to do with these images, I'm going to use Blender solution and my blender pen in order to highlight or add a little bit of texture in some areas. So once I'm done these mice and once they have dried, I'm going to use the blender refill and I'm going to add some texture to the mice. And it's a really fun way to get kind of a fur texture. You can also do this same method for, say, trees or just something where you want a little bit of like dotted texture. So the best way to do this is with the Copic blender solution. This is what you would use to refill the blender pens. And I use a really cheap, inexpensive face cloth. The cheaper the better because they tend to have more texture. This stamp has fur drawn in, so you don't see a whole lot of the texture on camera. Once I'm done doing the texture on the actual stamp, I'll color some on the scrap paper and then put this face cloth over top of it so that you can actually see the texture a little bit more. It just doesn't show up as much on like I said, on camera as it does in real life. And you can do as much or as little texture as you want. If you tap that face cloth on the colored areas very quickly, you won't get very much looking texture. But if you leave it on there and hold it on there like I just did on that scrap piece of paper, you'll see that you get a lot of texture showing up. So you can have a lot of fun with it and a lot of control with it. I'm doing this with a face cloth. You can also do this same technique with other fabrics with different textures just to get different looks. For the I Love You suckers, and they look like they're suckers with little, that the mice have gnawed to create the letters, I'm using R35, R37, and R39. So once again, I'm doing the light color, then I'll go in with the medium color, and then I'll go in with the dark color to get, or to deepen that shading. So I'm going to go all the way around the edges because these would be rounded and there would be some shading, but I'll do a little bit heavier at the bottom. I'm doing, again, a light touch because I don't want to get too much ink on there. If you do too much ink or a heavier touch, as you keep coloring it, the ink kind of pools out and it sometimes goes outside of the stamped image. So by having a really light touch in there, I'm not putting too much ink down. I'm getting that ink on there in order to blend it, but I'm not putting too much down. Once I have the darkest color, I'm going to go back in with the medium one and then with the light one. Exactly the same method as the mice, just different colors. Now this stamp set could be cute for a Valentine's card. We tend not to do a whole lot of Valentines in our family. We'll do the token little thing, but we don't go all out. We tend to take more value in how we treat each other throughout the year rather than one day of the year. So I'm not going to be making this as a Valentine's card per se. There's also a thinking of you stamp that goes with this set. So once I am done these images and start to put my card together, I'm going to add that thinking of you stamp on the inside of the card. So it's more of a love thinking of you card. I thought that was a really nice sentiment to have in there. I did do the lollipops red, even though this is not really Valentine's, just because I thought they would look nice as a really nice cherry red. I'm taking my blender pen and I'm adding a bit of a highlight to the top of those suckers. Now my blender pen isn't very wet, it's fairly dry, so I'm not getting a whole lot of color removal here, but that's what I wanted to go for. I didn't want a lot to it. If I wanted more coming out of there, I could take my blender solution and refill my pen. But I wanted to have a little bit more control, so I kept that pen a little bit on the dry side. But you can still see that there's a bit of a highlight there. If you wanted more of a highlight, there's 2 ways you could go about it. You could refill the pen and keep removing color. And what I do when I do that is I will remove some color. I'll let it completely dry. Then I'll remove a little bit more and I'll just keep working at it. And that way I'm not getting too much ink on the paper and having it pool out. Just like when you're coloring and blending, if I take that blender solution and just keep coloring the same area and not letting it dry in between, it just starts to pool out and that area gets bigger and bigger. And by letting it dry in between, I give that ink some time to dry and I have a little bit more control over it. The other way that you could add a highlight there if you didn't want to go the blender pen solution or the blender pen way is using a white marker, like a Signal white gel pen or something like that, and then coloring a highlight on top of it. I didn't want my highlight to be bright white. Once I have my images colored, I'm going to put some glossy accents on top of these pieces to make them nice and glossy. So I just wanted a little bit of a highlight there. I didn't want a white area on there. For my floor here underneath the mice, I'm using C1, C3, and C5. I'm just blending it out. When I inked or when I stamped to these images, that bottom shading part underneath the mice was kind of a continuous piece. So when I stamped it, I didn't stamp continuously because the images blended together. So by using these colors on the bottom, I'm just trying to feather out or fade out those harsh stamp lines, and it works perfectly. And by using 3 different colors, I can concentrate on the areas where I want to make sure to hide those parts so that they're not as visible. For the sucker sticks, I'm just using C1 and C3. Basically, when you have suckers, the sticks to them typically are white, but there would be a little bit of shading to it. The C1 is a barely there gray, you can barely see it, and the C3 will just add a little bit of shading to it. So I've got those pieces completely colored and ready to go. I'm going to take my die and I'm going to cut those out. This one is from the Spellbinders A2 Matting Basics set. This is the 3rd smallest one. I'm using this one from the set, and then later on I'm going to use the next biggest or the next size up and create a mat for these 3 guys. This was just a perfect size for each one of these images. There's going to be a lot of area around them, but I'm going to fill that in with a foiled background. But first, let's get this glossy accents on here and let that dry. When I use these glossy accents, I like to have a small bottle and really fine tips so I can get really detailed where I have it. When I use a little bit bigger of an area, I kind of like to do it like icing a cookie. I will do an outline of the whole area and then I'll flood it in. And that way I can make sure that I concentrate on getting a nice clean area and flood it in completely. It's self-level, so I don't need to worry about making sure everything is level. It will level out on its own. By having a nice fine tip here, I have a lot of control. If you happen to get any bubbles in it, once you've got it all out on your area, you can take a pin and just poke it. You want to make sure to do that while it's wet. Once it's dry, you're never going to get that bubble out. It's dried right in there. But to do it while it's wet, it's really, really easy to do. Just a pin, a push pin will work. Anything that has a sharp tip to it. I also put a little dot of the glossy accents on the mice eyes. I like them when they have nice beady eyes. And then I let them dry, and I actually let them dry overnight. I wanted to make sure that it was completely dry before I continued on with my card. For my background, I have some more Hammermill cardstock. I'm using some opal foil with this, and I'm using the Scattered Hearts Glimmer background. I wish this was a full background, but it's not, so we have to do this in 2 sections. This opal foil, once you have it off of your roll, it's really hard to tell which is the right side and which is the wrong side. So what I did when I got it off of the roll and off of, I cut the piece in half in order to do the 2 different sections so I didn't get any overfoiling, is I just made sure that I paid attention to which way I placed it on my desk so that I would know exactly which way to put it when I went to foil it. So I suggest not cutting it off and then laying it to the side, or pay attention to which side is which. But I ended up getting it done perfectly. I ended up doing 2 of those heart backgrounds, and then I went and used the negative foil to do a negative image. Now, because this background had to be in 2 sections, you do see a little bit of a seam in the center of that piece. I'm going to save this for a future project. I'm not using it for this particular one, and hopefully somehow we'll be able to hide it. That is one of the reasons why I prefer a full background. However, having a half a background and having to do it twice gives you a little bit more options. You could easily just fold or foil down the center of a card or just down one side or the other. But I love the opal look to that cardstock. I think it looks really, really pretty. So now I'm taking the next size up from that Matting Basics die set, cutting some nice red matching cardstock with it, and creating a mat out of there. I'm going to do that for all 3 of these images. to make sure that they're matted nicely. I think it frames them so nicely. I cut one on screen and the rest of them I cut off screen. I'm going to glue these little mice to their mats and have them set aside to dry while I work on the card base. I like to put an acrylic block over top of them while they're drying. It just holds everything down. Make sure that that glue has really good contact. Sometimes with wet adhesive, it starts to curl the paper a little bit. And by having something on top of there, it helps to make sure that they are down nice and flat. And it also frees up my hands to work on other things. I do love the flexibility though that a liquid adhesive gives you, because you have time to shimmy things in place, as well as the fact that you don't need to use a whole lot of glue, so it goes a long way. So for those two foiled heart pieces, I'm cutting them down to 4 inches by 5 1/4, and I'm going to ink blend them with a pumice stone distress ink. It's the closest color ink that I have to the little mice colors. I didn't want to do them red because to me that's a little bit too Valentine's-y, and I didn't want to do them gray because I kind of thought it was a little bit odd to have them matching the shadow underneath the mice. So I chose the pumice stone. When I first started inking it, I was worried that it was looking a little bit dirty, but once the card's together, it makes more sense. So I just have a blending brush here. I'm going back and forth into the ink. I'm only doing the outside part really because the image is going to go in the center. I'm not really concerned about having an even perfect blend. I'm making sure that I have darker areas around the outside and then it goes lighter towards the center. The darker areas around the outside helps to frame it a little bit, and the light in the center, it just is going to be covered from that image anyways, so I don't need to have the entire thing completely covered. If I wanted ink over the whole thing, I would probably go and either take my ink pad and go directly to the paper, or use a brayer or something to get an even coat over the whole thing. I'm really just wanting to get a little bit of color on there to make those hearts that are foiled on there pop a little bit more, because the foil doesn't take on the ink. I do see them a lot more once the cardstock is ink blended on. And now with those pieces done, I can set them to the side and I can work on the insert for the card. So I have another piece of hammer mill cardstock. It is 4 inches by 5 1/4. And I'm taking that stamp, that sentiment stamp, the Thinking of You that comes in this set. I'm lining it up at the bottom. I put my image on the top of it because I want to make sure that I have room for that and I don't have the two things crowding each other. In all honesty, have been up this day since 3:30 in the morning. So I had forgotten that I only stamped with Memento. I thought I had stamped and embossed. I was confusing it with a different card that I had done. So I went and stamped and embossed the center of this card. It works totally fine because we have the glossiness from the Glossy Accents anyways. But had I been thinking clearly, I probably would have just taken my Memento pad and stamped it. However, we're stamping and embossing it. So I just stamped it with Versamark ink. I did use my ink or my embossing powder tool on top of it just to make sure that that powder and is only going to stick to the ink. It's not going to stick to anything else on the cardstock. Once I have the powder on there, I use my embossing tool to melt it. And then I'm using my favorite trick for creating faux matting. I'm using the chisel end of my medium red color, and I'm just going around the edges for both my insert as well as my two foiled pieces. This just creates a faux matted look. I like that red around there, but because I'm doing a tri-fold card and I have my images already on a mat, plus I have these pieces, I thought doing another mat would be a little bit too thick. The card itself is already thick with just these layers, so the perfect solution is creating a faux mat. So I have two folded cards here, and I'm taking just a sliver off of one side of each one of them. And by a sliver, I mean it doesn't even need to be 1/8 of an inch, like a 1/16 is good. Just a sliver is all you need. Once I have that sliver off, that shorter piece is going to be on the back of the one that is on the left, and it's going to be on the front of the one that is on the right. So basically when you glue them together, I want that shorter piece put inside the fold of the other one. So I'm going to take my liquid glue and I'm going to put it all over the back side of the right card here. So this is the full side. The right part of that right card has that sliver taken off. The right part of the left card has the sliver taken off. And when you glue them together, because we use the liquid glue, you can shimmy it into place just to make sure that everything is snug and fits right. It really only takes a few seconds. And then I put an acrylic block on it and let it dry for a few seconds just to make sure that that glue was starting to hold. I'm using Barely Art glue and it does start to hold really quite quickly. I'm actually quite impressed with how quickly that glue starts to hold and grab. So you do have a few seconds to shimmy it in place, but it does start to grab fairly quickly. I'm starting from the center of the card and I'm working my way out. So I've got the pieces for the center on there, and now I'm going to work on the right flap. I'm going to put one of my ink blended heart foiled backgrounds on there and center that. And in the middle, while I'm putting glue on the next piece, I have an acrylic block on there, holding everything nice and flat. That way I can basically glue things together a little bit quicker. I'm not using my hands to hold things in place while they're drying. The acrylic block does a perfect job of this. Then I put my image piece for that. And then I'm working on the card front. Now at this point, when I put it onto the card front and I was putting my acrylic block on there to hold everything in place, I was realizing that the glossy accents, the dimension that was adding was starting to add up here, which is another reason why I didn't put another mat behind each one of these panels, because it is getting to be a little bit on the bulky side. It's not bulky, but once you have that glossy accents piled on top of each other, you can start to feel it and it's not completely flat. So I opened it up to put that acrylic block down. And then the entire time I was putting this thing together, I kept thinking, oh, I got to do those mice nose. I got to do the mice nose. So I did that at the very end there, just added a little bit of the same red color that I did the matte for the mice nose. And here is the final result of the trifold card. Now you could easily use this as a Valentine's card if that is your thing and you wanted to do that. I'm just using it as a thinking of you card. And I absolutely love how it turned out. These images are absolutely adorable. I love House Mouse Designs images and they're so much fun to color. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you being here.